can even hear it.
Here we go. Is your internet Yeah. To be fair, that's me every time.
It's always me.
Join like midway through.
Back when I would frequent people's like house parties, I would usually show up an hour or two late.
Nice. House party is a very casual thing, so.
Yes. The problem is I sometimes take that rule and apply it to adult parties, and that doesn't work.
I mean, people's had enough to drink. Maybe it's okay.
Pretty sure I went to one of Becky's parties. I was late. All right, so it is 6:02. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Performative Gestures. My name is Brittany Brooke Crow.
I am Michelle Marie.
And we are going to go ahead and get started. Let me make sure I have my recording going. Boom. Awesome. Perfect. All right. So meeting etiquette today. For those tuning in through the live feed, y'all don't have to worry about any of this. For those of you on Zoom with us today, we just asked that if you have any questions or comments, which we would love to hear your questions and comments, please go ahead and jump into the chat box. Type them there. We're going to be kind of both monitoring that throughout our discussion and answering them kind of as they come in or as they organically relate or fit into our discussion. So please type those there. We want you to participate. Is there anything else I'm forgetting, Michelle?
No, I think that's it. You guys are welcome to interrupt us as you please as we explore this conversation, and I think we're ready to start cooking with gas.
All right, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Brittany Brooke Crow. I'm an artist based here in Des Moines, Iowa, and I have a studio in the Fitch building. My work uses a combination of performance and photography, and I explore ideas of intimacy, vulnerability, distance, disruption. And while the final form of my work is often photographic, I tend to explore performance throughout the image-making process. So almost all my photographs come from some sort of performative action.
I am a movement artist. I work primarily in improvisation, and my work seeks to understand kind of the impetus of our movement within our bodies and beyond the confines of our vessel. At the base of it all, my practice is investigative and intuitive, so I'm aimed to integrate both like internal and external stimuli into an embodied experience.
So we're really excited to have you here today. Michelle and I kind of started talking actively, was it April, February?
Yeah, a few months ago.
So we were already
quarantined.
Yeah, that's right. As we started quarantining, we already had a dialogue going, and so we kind of wanted to take that dialogue that we had going that started kind of in direct messages on Instagram and move to a Google Doc, which we will be referencing today. And we wanted to take that and bring it live to you all and kind of show you some of our thought process. We noticed that we both have similar approaches, not just to our work, but also to how we conceptualize what we want to share from our work, if that makes sense. So that's where we're going to start today.
Yeah, I was telling Brittany Brooke when we were getting ready for this that the kind of way we should be advertising it is that we both work with our bodies, and being in quarantine has forced everything to be digital. So now we're being forced to actually take a step back and get a bit more cerebral with our practices, which is really unusual. So thanks for joining us in the great Google Doc experiment that we're about to into.
So welcome to Art Week if you haven't tuned in for any Art Week events yet.
Yes. So one thing that we did here was we took this Google Doc that we've titled Artistic Inquiry, much to our delight, and I reached out to Brittany Brooke and I said, I've been thinking a lot about collaboration, and I noticed that both of us are really private people, and we're highly selective on who we include in the world of our practice. So it gave me this notion that working with you, Brittany, was automatically going to be something that I would cherish and feel safe with. And so I was wondering, hey, let's start this Google Doc and maybe we can kind of open a shared line of aesthetic questioning together. A digital call and response is the quote I have that I sent you on Instagram. It seems like we're curious about similar things that you mentioned already. And so this exercise is kind of a free flow investigation together. And I said, hey, let all of that stew. And I kind of dumped that into this Google Doc here.
What's really interesting too is when we talk about how we're relatively private about our practices and selective about who we let in, we kind of more, and correct me if I'm wrong for you, Michelle, but I believe we kind of approach that more of who we collaborate with and who we talk to in the early stages of the conceptualization of an idea. I think I have maybe, in addition to Michelle, maybe like 6 or 7 other people that I share that with. So I tend to keep that kind of small. Right, like we're both, there's something about the early process of an idea that you kind of want to cradle it really close and kind of see what it's going to start to be before you start to share it. And sometimes for me, I don't like to share some of my work until it's in a final realized form with the majority of people. And granted, there's pros and cons to that, but that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Yeah, you're definitely right that we're the same in that kind of way. Of the circle of who I let into that the early processes is very small. I was it's limited to maybe like 5 people, and I know that like one of those people is here right now. So in a way, doing this with you is pretty terrifying to let people listen to this. So I think it's a good exercise for both of us. But I've lost my train of thought. What was I gonna say? I don't know.
That's all right.
I agree with you though.
Well, and as we started approaching today's conversation too, there are certain aspects of our work or aspects of our identity that are similar too. So I use the word queer to identify. Do you use the word queer too, Michelle?
Yeah. I just think it's nice. Catch all.
Queer phrase. So we're both queer women, and that in some way or another does come up in our work. Although we kind of touched on, Michelle, how we don't feel like we're actively queering our relative practices. I mean, we are by just making within those practices, but there's maybe not that intention quite there yet.
Yeah, I think one thing that is kind of strikes me about what both of us do is like, yes, we are queer women, but that's, a lot of queer artists, that's really like the locus of what they're doing. And I think for us, it's just sort of something that exists, but isn't necessarily the lens through which we are working. But like you were saying, to me earlier, they haven't heard this. When we go back and look at our previous work, we see ways in which maybe that has informed what we were doing that we weren't even aware of. So that is something that I always think about retroactively.
Well, I know for me, when it comes to engaging my queer identity, I want to do it in a way that's intentional, meaningful, and that isn't just throwaway. I'm not saying that anyone does that, but I do think it's really easy to get bogged down as a queer person. Like, oh, I need to make art that represents this aspect of myself and of my community, which of course not any one of us can speak for the entire community, and we know that. But there's still, I felt that pressure before, especially when I have found myself in spaces where I am one of the only queer people present. But I I don't think it's necessary to directly engage that or to make work that's very flagrant. Because I think of queer abstraction, right? Queer abstraction was an exhibition that came to the Des Moines Art Center, for those of you who are not familiar. And it was work by artists who identify somewhere underneath the umbrella term of queer, whether that was if they were trans or intersex, bi, gay, straight, non-binary, etc. And it was really interesting because a lot of the artists didn't really, the work itself was very conceptual, very abstract, lots of form, more so than anything representational. And a lot of the artists approach queer as a verb. And so that's kind of going back to, I think there are ways to approach our practices where we're like queering dance or queering photography. But I know for me, I'm not sure what that looks like yet. And maybe it's happening and I don't know it.
Yeah, I know for me as well, that's not something that I am currently looking at, but like Dan said in the chat, turning it in that way is pretty intentional, like you just said. But working with form is obviously something that both of us do. And to go back a little bit, you were talking about kind of cradling our practice. And I think that that, for me, is the biggest intention that's happening out of all of these intentional labels is sort of making my practice into a form itself, and it's sort of this ongoing, constantly shape-shifting thing.
I did actually, so while you were talking, Michelle, I thought of a way that maybe in my work I might be starting to hit that queer label. So a lot of my recent work has been these self-portraits of myself, in which I am very specifically trying to explore that idea of artist as model and model as artist, or what happens when the person who is behind the camera is also the same person in front of the camera. So like when we're looking back on our history, a lot of models were women and a lot of the artists were historically men. So I've objectified myself in a way instead of having someone else make me the object of their art. So I wonder if that like self-objectification is in itself queer, but I'm not really sure yet. I'm not sure. There's a lot to unpack there. And I think it's really hard to say a lot about the underpinnings of a body of work as it's developing. I think it becomes a lot easier, like you said, Michelle, in retrospect, when you're looking back and realizing, okay, I am dealing with these themes, and I'm dealing with them in this work and this work now, and I want to intentionally take that lens now and put it onto this body of work.
Yeah, I want to go back a little bit to something that you said, though, about, like, what does it mean to objectify the self? Because I know that both of us, like, you photograph yourself and I film myself, and we have to go back and like stare at our bodies and parse through the material that we have. And I'm just wondering, you know, is that a question that you've considered? Do you feel like you're objectifying yourself, or what does it even mean to self-objectify?
Yeah, that's something I'm still trying to wrap my head around. I think by photographing myself, I am inherently objectifying myself to some extent, especially in the sense that I am not clothed in my photographs, and that immediately changes the dialogue with that image. And you mentioned going back and having to look through all of these images of yourself, and I find that really odd to pull up all of my photographs, and for every photograph that I usually share, I have another 100 at least that I've shot. So I'm scrolling through hundreds of photographs of myself with this mirror right now. And it's just this weird process of looking closely. And then when I go in and do minor blemish removal, like let's say oftentimes
Hey guys. Y'all there still? Everyone's good? Okay. I think we might have lost Brittany. I think it wasn't me. I'm the host now. Alright. Just Brittany. Well, hopefully we'll get her back here shortly. Stephanie, Michelle, could you speak about queerness and theme? Frankly, I don't want to speak out of turn. My work is already so emergent, I guess. I'm young, and I haven't been making work for a very long time. I'm only 25, and I don't know, I've known that I've been queer my whole life, but it's not something that I'm engaging with directly, so it is, like I mentioned earlier, I'll notice when I go back. Maybe something's happening. I think for me, queerness in my work has to do with the fact that I don't believe in traditional dance technique, and so I'm working from a place of trying to kind of abstract what the idea of a movement vocabulary is and kind of like fuck with what that means. So maybe there's something there. It's something I definitely am interested in thinking about more privately, but at the moment I don't have any kind of explicit statement about queerness as the theme within my own work. Brittany!
I'm back!
Great!
Sorry everyone, we lost internet connection at my house briefly, so that's fun. But yeah. You want me to jump in?
No, sorry. I had to flip my screen when you were gone, and now I've got everything back in line. Okay, so queerness not really a theme in my work. Brittany, maybe it's kind of coming, but we're not really sure. Looking back at our little Google Doc here, I asked about self-objectification, if that's intentional, and you said to me, modeling is the closest I've come to meditation. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, because for me, meditation is very important, and I would be curious if we have any connecting threads there, or what our different perspectives are on that.
Yeah, so for those of you who might not be aware, I have a history of modeling for different artists, for arts classes, specifically drawing primarily, but also photography and painting here and there. But the process of modeling, especially the process of modeling for life drawing, in which I have to stay really still and hold a pose, sometimes upwards of 45 minutes, depending on what the artist or group of artists need. That process of having to achieve stillness is, I find, really meditative. And I say it's the closest I come to meditation because I, as a person, really struggle to find that stillness and to force myself to sit with that stillness in everyday life. And when I have an audience of, say, 10 to 20 people observing me, trying to draw me, that stillness is so important. I can't break that stillness. And it's not possible to stay in one pose without moving at all for 45 minutes. Like, I will move. I sometimes will shake a little, or I'll have to temporarily maybe like stretch my arm and move it back. And usually I'll give the artist a heads up that I'm doing it, or sometimes I will over time sag, which is the absolute worst and what I try not to do. But that entire process of being very aware of myself in my body, I say it's the closest I've come to meditation, because there's this very, I have to focus on my body. And there's this whole process of meditation, I forget what it's called, but it has to deal with like where you are intentionally focusing on your body to meditate. Because I was telling my therapist about this process of modeling, and he was like, oh yeah, that's a meditative practice. We will go into that. And you've done some modeling too, Michelle.
Yeah, I did in undergraduate. I modeled, and that was like my undergraduate job, and it was amazing to get paid like $24 an hour to just be naked in front of people. But I actually like have a completely different idea about it than you. I think like for me, both modeling and meditation are experiences where I can let absolutely everything in. And it's not about the stillness, but rather kind of like the microcosm of events that are happening within me. And like you said, it's a way for you to get really in tune with your body. And like, that's my whole thing. When I'm improvising is like, I'm just trying to ascertain every little bit of data that is coming in from the outside and sort of exposing itself on the inside. So, yeah, as I'm thinking about it, the way that I view modeling and the way I view meditation is almost the exact opposite of you. But both of them I enjoy greatly.
I should say for the record, I'm not practiced in meditation, so that is something that's really new to me.
I meditate now probably like 3 to 5 times a week. I wish I did it every day. I used to be really, really strict about it. And I kind of came to that because an undergraduate, so I started in the modern program, and you're required to do one somatic practice you have to sign up for. So I started with yoga because everybody does yoga. And I found that it was like the only thing that really fulfilled me in doing yoga, meditation at the beginning and then the shavasana at the end. And everything else was like overwhelming. It was too much movement, and I found my central nervous system being like flooded with information, and I would get like faint, and it was very bizarre. So then I started doing Feldenkrais, which is lower and slower, and if you know anything about that, it's really, really internal, and the movement is supposed to be really just as minuscule and as slow as possible. And I found that that was a way that I could get all of the information from my body that I wanted without feeling like I was going to go flying off a carousel that was going 100 miles an hour. And then I got to meditate. The good stuff.
I don't think I've ever experienced yoga as flying off a carousel, but I understand.
Yeah,
What about it do you think was so overwhelming for you?
I don't know if it's because I'm a sensitive baby, or because I've always focused my work on being as tuned into my body as possible, but it was like being mandated these postural changes at certain times and having to hold certain postures. It was like counterintuitive to what I was feeling or what I wanted to do with my body. And as we have kind of mentioned in our Google Doc, like intuitivity or intuitiveness is something that is essential for me making work. I need it to come from that organic place.
Yeah, I feel like you have a very different lens to view meditation and yoga through as someone who comes from that dance background. I think it's really interesting to talk to you because I have no background in dance. I have dabbled in a couple loose dance forms here and there, so it's really interesting to take our practices and compare them in that way.
I think that's like one of the things that I enjoy about viewing your work and hearing about your practice, though, is that I did a professional program. I studied modern dance. I danced in companies, and I hated it. I hated every second of it. I was so miserable. I didn't like any of it. And so I've like spent the past however many years, and I'm going to spend my entire life, my entire career, like trying to escape all of that. So I'm really drawn to like seeing the forms that you make and like what comes out of your work with your body, because you're not like approaching it from like ballet or something like that. And this is actually something I wonder about when I view your images is how do you get in those positions? Like what, because I know that the way you set up your shots is a performance for yourself. So could you maybe like speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, kind of the process of my shooting right now.
Yeah.
So my process might change because I did recently buy a remote for my camera, which is amazing. I used to have one for one of my old cameras, and then when I used to use film, I used to use a cable release. But lately, most of my photos have been through self time, which I think is hilarious. So all the photographs you see on my feed right now are all from using the self timer built into my camera. And I'll set it up so that like there's 20 seconds at the front end. That gives me 20 seconds to quickly get into place. And then I have it set up to take anywhere from 5 to 9 shots, depending on how I feel that day, back to back, with maybe a couple seconds in between. And so as my camera is clicking, I am striking a pose, holding it, striking a pose, holding it. If I'm moving in between, that's usually fine because I'm shooting at a fast enough shutter speed and I'm using strobes. But I do try to at least hold the pose in order to kind of feel what my body feels like in that way. So some of the positions that I have found myself in, I'm not sure what's going on. Like there's this one where I have my leg over my head, and I think I was actually trying to do something that I've learned either in yoga, something related to yoga or to dance that I was trying to reference, but the hilarity of it is that I can't move like that yet. Like I'm not a very flexible individual. My flexibility, I have a lot of room for growth.
I just want to say, let me stop you right there. Flexibility is bullshit. You do not need it. This is one, I will die on this hill. Just flexibility is a crock of shit that some colonialists sold people when they were making dance. So just forget about it.
All right, so flexibility.
Yeah. Do what feels good.
Do what feels good. But yeah, so and what's interesting too is like as I'm photographing, not all of the movements I do feel good. Some of the I just noticed that Michael Van Dyke in the comments said wireless remotes save lives, so I had to like see that really quick. That is true. But yeah, no, going back to like the movement, yeah, some of the poses that I strike are not comfortable. Most of them aren't, and most of the ones that I find are the most interesting are either incredibly uncomfortable. I feel incredibly exposed while doing them, or if they're not either of those, it's this ever so slight change. What am I trying to say? There's like a nuance to it because sometimes as I'm taking all these photos, if I move just ever so slightly between the photographs, I find that sometimes that ever so slight movement will create something that's way more interesting than if I had made a big movement. And I tend to have this tendency to try to move a lot between stills, and that often creates very awkward photographs that are not interesting, if that makes sense.
I mean, it makes sense what you're saying, but I don't know if I agree with you. The idea of what's awkward or what's not interesting is obviously like so subjective, and I would be very curious to see like 50 photographs all together of just like one pose and see all of the minutia that happens in those few seconds, because like for me, I think that's where the magic is. I was filming with Sam Fakla at the Art Center for my Museum Monday, and we were in the pay wing at that incredible spiral staircase. And at one point, he was just telling me, like, slow down, slow down, slow down. And we collaborate frequently. This is a direction that he gives me every time. And there was this moment where I think for this like 5-minute long track that he had playing, I didn't technically even move out of a pose, but I at the same time felt as if I had done an entire dance. And to me, that like constellation of sensation that happens within you in those moments of stillness or slowness is really where the juice is.
Yes. You ever find in your practice that you have to create either barriers or constraints around what you're trying to do in order to create something? Or in order to work against, like, I guess in that instance, you were collaborating with Sam and he specifically directed you to slow down. But I kind of see that as like a way of working against what you naturally like tend to do.
Well, it's a fascinating question, and I'm not sure I have an answer. But what I will say is I do find that I have all of these patterns ingrained within my movement process, and I want to undo those. I want to like liberate myself from my own impulses and be able to like move from a place of like kind of this boundless unknowingness. So when you were talking about, oh, I hit these poses that are uncomfortable and it feels like I kind of like go for the similar things all the time. I also find that in my improvisation, I kind of repeat these patterns and I'm really trying to escape that. What did Dan say here? If you accelerate your constructive process by the convenience of a remote trigger, do you lose the intensity of your creativity or even time to manage your intention?
That is a question. So that kind of ties into what the question that I was just asking you. So one of the ulterior motives that I had for asking that question to you, Michelle, is because, is that I've noticed I need to implement certain parts in my process or certain steps in my process in order to loosen up. I have this habit of being very stiff. I know what a really good photograph looks like in my head. But if I'm thinking about that too much as I'm actually making photographs, oftentimes the photographs don't turn out. And so one of the things I found with the self-time process, one of the reasons, I had to use it because that was the only way to get the shot before I had my wireless remote come in the mail. But I also used it intentionally because I saw it as a way to disrupt that active creation, or what am I trying to say? That it was an intentional decision to use that to force myself to play. And so going to Dan's question, I'm not sure if I agree with accelerate. If you accelerate your constructive process, I think the convenience of a remote trigger is going to change how I make, but I do think that I'm probably going to continue to play with the timer as well. I kind of want to go back and forth between the two, initially at least, to kind of see how those photos change or how the photos differ from when I use the remote versus when I use the timer. But the main reason I purchased the timer is that I wanted that flexibility to be able to have something. So if I ever do intentionally create a shot and I know it's good, I want to be able to capture it. I want to be able to capture it immediately. And there's like other things too that it like sets up that'll make it easier. Right now, yeah, I don't know. But going to Dan's question, I don't know if it'll lose the intensity or I'll lose the intensity of my creativity, but I do think any time that you bring in any sort of change to your process, it is going to affect the process. So time will tell.
Yeah, I think that acknowledging Dan's question, in terms of how accelerating can alter the intensity or time management, it goes back to this kind of like intuitive seesaw. On one hand, you have sort of, by the act of this limited time constraint, you're forced to just go with an action with whatever that sort of gut intuition is. But then on the other hand, you know, you really do need kind of this slow and slow time to get out of your own head and out of your own thinking process, to sort of let things generate on their own. I might be wrong, but I think that I'm right about that for both of us.
I feel like it's true for me right now anyway.
I just, for me at least, I know that if I meditate before I dance, or if I am able to do like a long form improvisation for like a good 2 or 3 hours, then I can really get somewhere. Otherwise, if I'm just like, okay, I'm gonna bang something out in 10 minutes, I almost get caught up in the sort of self-timer idea of like, okay, whatever happens, happens. And, you know, that's intuition in one way, but is that what I'm looking for? Who knows?
When I have found that, it's funny, so I had therapy earlier today, as I alluded to earlier, and it's really interesting how much I talk about, well, of course I talk about my art practice in therapy. I'm an artist. And one of the things that came up today was how I often have this habit of putting off things, and I'm not sure if it's procrastination. I think it's more connected to that perfectionist tendency that I have that I need to continue to break up. And anytime that I put off a project, or let's say I do actually have a deadline, whether it's for a commission or like recently I received a cool cutout in the mail from Mark Joshua Epstein, who was one of the artists in Queer Abstraction, and I was instructed to make a photo with it. And I had that thing with me for a good 2 to 3 weeks, and I didn't do anything with it. And I finally did this weekend, and the photograph is interesting. I'm excited about the photograph, but I cannot help but wonder how different that photograph would have been had I given myself more time, or at least started to approach playing with it earlier and taking multiple photos with it earlier. So I notice anytime that I put something off in that respect, where I constrain my time in a way that I have to get something done immediately, that's another way that I set myself up to create an image that I'm usually not happy with.
Okay, I want to ask or probe a little bit, because you mentioned perfectionism. And
Yes.
for me, that's something that I'm guilty of in like my academic or like non-art professional career, that's really kind of plagued me. And so in my art, that's really like something that I'm trying to escape. And one question that I wrote down for you actually was that, you know, your current portrait series that you're doing is pristine. Like the images that you put out are like absolutely beautiful to me. Like the technique is flawless. And so I'm wondering like how that plays with these like really messy themes that you're trying to investigate. Like we're talking about intimacy, we're talking about vulnerability, like you're putting your body out there. And I just like wonder how you kind of reconcile those two things.
I think the easiest answer to that is that I haven't. So looking back at former series that I have created, in addition to the current series that I'm making, I am attempting to explore ideas of intimacy and vulnerability. And I feel like the more I try to explore those ideas, the easier it is for me to end up going into the other direction. So I distance myself.
Mm.
And so there's this constant push-pull that I notice, and I don't think I have figured it out yet. I don't think that the themes of my work are as clear as I want them to be. And it's possible, too, that maybe my work is going to shift directions away from those things. But right now, I know I'm interested in those topics of intimacy and vulnerability, distance as well, because I think that kind of plays a role in that idea of whether you're intimate or not. Yeah, I don't think I've resolved it. I think I'm still trying to make work to figure out what that means. And I think what's really hard about it is when I approach photography, I want my photos to it's important to me that they look well done, and I'm not sure that necessarily should be important. I can't help but wonder how much of that is related to aspects of my identity and to trying to prove my worth. Because I do feel like a lot of my work is, hey, I promise I'm an artist. Here's my art. Like, it looks really good. It's in a frame.
Well, I don't think that there has to be a reconciliation. I certainly don't think that there has to be a clarity, at risk of sounding someone who's like, art for art's sake. Like, I don't mean to make you worry about any of that. I'm just curious if that's something that you're considering. But be messy. Everything I make is messy. I just put bullshit up on the internet, and it's for me. And if it felt good, it felt good. And I'm much more interested in the investigation and in the experiment than in the kind of material object. But also, I make time-based work, and you make material work. A photograph is much different than me moving around in any given environment and then capturing it on video and trying to explain okay, so this is what the snow globe of my body felt like when I was doing this.
Well, and I like that you brought up the importance of that process of making. There's an irony in the fact that I do care as much as I do in the final product, because when I talk about my work, I talk about the process and how important the process is, and how the process often incorporates these performative actions that I'm trying to reference. So like with my self-portrait series, it's those actions that I'm directly making for the camera. In previous series, it's been me physically going and meeting certain people to have their photograph, to take their photograph. So the fact that I say that I focus on the process, but I still have this tendency to, I don't know, hold the product or hold that final piece on a pedestal, I think is an inherent problem in my work that I haven't really figured out yet. But I'm really excited about your work, especially with 1 Second Dances that you're currently doing. For those of you who don't follow 1 Second Dances on Instagram, you should, at 1 Second Dances.
Yes.
What you talked about today, earlier today, you mentioned how you kind of have approached that work as sort of an aspect of self-portraiture, and I'm interested in that.
Yeah, so I was thinking about, this talk tonight, and what do we have in common in our practices, what don't we, and entertaining all these ideas, and it just struck me Brittany Brooke makes portraits, but I think I also make portraits. 1 Second Dances was born as a way for me to begin to identify a movement vocabulary and have this digital dictionary of the ways that I move throughout my day to day. And I just realized, that project is going to be a year old in August. And so I've looked at my movements and my gestures under a microscope every day for almost a year now, which is the most sustained exercise in a continuous fashion that I've done examining my movement. And so, yeah, I think that is self-portraiture in a way, and I am really excited to explore this idea of okay, if 1 Second Dances is this living portrait of myself, and what does that mean, and where does the project go from there?
So before I noticed the time, we did receive a couple questions on the Google survey that
I was about to say, before we run out of time, we need to address the audience questions.
So I'm going to start with your question, Michelle.
Okay.
The question this person had for you is, does your mood dictate how you move? That's the first part of this 2-part question. Does your mood dictate how you move? Do you find that in the movement it may heighten or dissipate such feelings?
Absolutely dictates how I move. When I started my improvisation practice years ago, that was the whole thing. It was this is pleasure politics, and I'm just gonna feel how I feel, and maybe that's angry or sensual or or happy or sad or whatever, and that's what's going to inform the improvisation for today. So it would absolutely be a lie to say that it doesn't. And now I'm kind of working with what does that mean to me now, and how has it changed over the years. But yes, absolutely. And to answer the second part of that, in terms of heightening or dissipating, I mean, I hate to keep harping on meditation, but it is it is like a movement meditation, right? And so allowing whatever the feelings are, whether we're talking like emotional feelings, tactile feelings, I think feelings has a lot of different meanings in a movement context. It does heighten or dissipate, and that just comes from the intuitive place that I work from. Improvisation, you don't know where it's going to lead you, and it is like following these impulses and listening to them. So yeah, some days I'll end my practice and I'll be really heightened on whatever emotion or feeling that I started with, and some days I will have transformed it into a completely different thing. And for me, that's the beauty of being an improviser. So yeah. Brittany, we have a question for you that says, do you have a preconceived narrative for your work prior to shooting?
Sometimes. Or sometimes I've tried. So do I have a preconceived narrative for my work? My current body or developing body of work of these self-portraits that I've been shooting with Amir, that came out of an idea that I first had back in undergrad, where I was really curious what happened. I noticed that there were, well, throughout photographic art history, but art history as a whole, but specifically photography, people like Lee Friedlander have these giant bodies of work of naked women on couches. And I found a lot of that to be really problematic for multiple reasons. And as I started to investigate this history of specifically male photographers photographing naked women and using women as their muses, I was really interested in how that entire notion of the gaze or who's looking at whom would change if the same person is both the model and the artist. And I really wanted to explore that, especially because at that point that I was having that idea, I had already been modeling for a couple of years. So I already was drawing from that. So my current body of work came from that thread that never quite went away. And I tried to take a couple pictures back in undergrad, and they just fell. Like sometimes there are ideas that I have, and I'll try them out, and they just don't work. And for whatever reason, I knew that I had to explore this again. Even if it did fail again, I needed to, there was something there that I was still interested in. As far as how the body of work is developing, I don't really have a narrative for it. Narrative as a whole doesn't really play into my work currently. Like the individual photographs don't aim to tell a story, I don't think. And I want to highlight the I don't think part. But yeah, as far as a preconceived narrative right now, no, I don't have that. But sometimes, kind of quickly circling back to what I was saying before, if I overthink a project idea before I go and shoot, more often than not, the photographs don't work. Like, there's something about that for me that just doesn't work. Some photographers, some artists it works for, it doesn't work for me.
I would like, after this, challenge you to consider like what narrative means to you, because I really think that this idea that like you're producing a series of images that like has a narrative, I just don't think that has to be true for you, especially since I know that you have like kind of a dedicated journaling practice, and what you're making is really your sort of like internal intimacy with yourself and vulnerability. And I think that it would be really interesting for you to look at how that sort of internal narration maybe informs what's happening. And yeah, I think there might be narrative there. It's just, it's not a story.
Or at least not what we traditionally think of as a story with a beginning, middle, and end. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Definitely.
Another question we had from the Google survey was for both of us. So, Michelle, what inspires you to create the performances you create?
It should be illegal to ask artists this question, I think. Like, this morning, for example, I woke up and I was thinking about, like, when you are, when you're laying with a lover and you can, like, feel each other's stomachs as you're breathing, and the way that there's, like, this really, it's pressure, but it's also kind of, like, guarded and tender, like, you're receiving that oxygen in a way that's not pushing against each other, but is, like, providing support. And I was thinking about the feeling of, like, palms and wondering how I could, like, capture that feeling and, like, what would it feel like to make that sensation go through my whole body. And that was, like, what I wanted to reflect on in my improvisation today. So, I mean, what inspires you to create the performances that you do? I guess I'm an incredibly, like, sensual person. I want to, like, feel all of the feelings and smell all the smells and taste all the tastes, and, like, I just want to, like, feel every sense that I can. And so I think a lot of my inspiration is drawn from this really, like, indulgence or luxuriousness or decadence, and that's kind of to serve my my tendencies to be a little bit too rigorous in real life. So there's, like, this fantasy to it that inspires me.
I'm supposed to probably ask that to myself, huh?
Yes. What inspires you to create your performances?
So I do agree with you that I feel like this is always a difficult question to answer as an artist, because I feel like inspiration comes from everything that an artist takes in. So for me, my inspiration is from what I read, what I look at, what I see in my daily life, my personal experiences, media I consume, movies, television shows, that sort of thing. So I feel like it's really hard to often pinpoint what inspires any specific piece of work. But going to my current body of work, it's definitely that personal experience of modeling. That's part of it. Within the last year, I started playing with dance and movement more as a way of, well, just to get my body to move more. I identified that I am not as active as I want to be, and it's really important to me that I become more active. So I started using movement in ways to feel new feelings and to explore what my body was capable of. And that includes, like, some weightlifting too, which is fantastic. But so I feel like those experiences have inspired that current work that I'm making. Especially as I move more in my body, I'm becoming more comfortable again in my skin. Similar to, like, when I first started modeling, I became comfortable in my skin. So there's this constant push-pull, and I feel like I'm rediscovering what I'm capable of. I know. Go ahead.
Oh, I really like that. I'm thinking about, like, I'm trying to, if I were to refine this answer, like, I just want to feel every feeling, and that's an infinite thing. So the inspiration is, like, this constant pursuit of new sensation.
Yeah, and I know for me, one thing that I identified in trying to figure out why I create, there were a couple years there where I wasn't making a lot, and I really questioned, why do I even want to make? What is the purpose of making? Is this really what I want to do? And I'm sure I'm going to keep questioning this the rest of my life. It's exhausting, but
Never-ending cycle.
It is. It's a cycle. But one of the things that I did identify is I want to find joy through the process of making. And if I'm not enjoying the process of making, I need to identify why I'm not enjoying it and what needs to change. And there was something really fun about just starting to pose in front of the camera again. There was something really invigorating. Like, I have myself. I'm always going to have this self for as long as I am alive. And I can always turn the camera back toward it. And that, there's an excitement to that I really enjoy.
Yeah, I love that. I know we need to wrap it up here in just a few minutes, but Dan, we do see your question about going back to narrative. How long does the narrative have to be? Like with 1 minute dances, the intention can be micro narrative. Yes, absolutely. I think that with each 1 second dance for each day, that 1 second is like a microcosm of all the movement that I did in that day, and I try to distill it down into which 1 second feels like it represents this day, or all the movements the most to me. And then there's that overarching narrative of like my movement vocabulary. So there's kind of 2 narrative tracks happening for me in that project. That's all I'm gonna say because I want to give Brittany Brooke a chance to answer, and then Mitchell has a question too.
I think going off of what Michelle is saying, looking at my work again, I still think I need to really consider what narrative means to me. I think that was a good question that Michelle posed to me. And the more I think about it, the more I recognize, yes, 1 photograph, just like 1 painting, can hold a narrative. I think it's possible. So Mitchell's question, do you want to go ahead and read it?
Yeah, so Mitchell, who we both adore, thank you for attending, has asked, as contemporary feminist artists, can you quickly speak to the shape of your practice and how it might be imagining or proposing radical social alternatives? So, I'll go ahead and say something because I see the cogs are grinding in Brittany Brooke's head. I think one thing for me about my practice that feels very feminist and very radical is that I'm working very hard every day to escape the confines of traditional dance technique, which is racist, which is sexist, which is homophobic. This like incredibly Eurocentric imperialist sort of standard that we have in almost all dance forms is something that I want to escape. So if I'm teaching, that's like working from an improvisation framework that doesn't impose any kind of rule or confine on the people who are sharing space with me, and I want the people that I collaborate with or that I teach to be my equal. And then in my individual practice, I think that is a much deeper question that I really want to work to investigate more, because I feel in my daily social life that I am feminist and that I'm trying to at least work toward or uphold radical ideas, but I don't think that I am honoring those in the way that I want to in my practice currently. So it's certainly something that I need to keep thinking about and need to keep working on.
Yeah. So in mine, as a contemporary feminist artist, so the shape of my practice, I think I'm still trying to figure out what that shape is. I'm very unsure of myself as an artist, which feels odd to say publicly in front of other individuals, but I'm really uncertain of where I'm going in my art. I have these ideas that I want to explore, like intimacy and vulnerability, but the actual shape of my practice is still developing. I'm slowly learning to develop habits of going into the studio, but I think honestly one of the things that I'm trying to embrace as an artist is I'm trying to embrace that radical compassion for myself, and it's very difficult. On the days that I don't feel like making, or that I don't make it to the studio, or I have severe depression, anxiety, and there are times where I can't get out of bed, like and it's really difficult, and I will end up in these negative feedback loops of beating myself up for not being able to make my art. And all that does is just make it even harder for me to eventually make my art again. And so I'm trying to learn how to not necessarily embrace it, but accept that those are parts of myself, and accept that there are times that I won't make. And I feel like that's kind of radical, honestly. Especially in a society of productivity. And after going through academia and an academic program for art where you had to be making all the time and you had to be making new work all the time and showing only the new work all the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, Mitchell, going back to Mitchell Squire's question, how the shape of my practice and how it might be imagining proposing radical social alternatives. I think I'm still exploring that, and I think I'm really excited you asked this question because, kind of like what Michelle said, I'm not sure if I'm honoring that fully, and I want to honor that.
Yeah. And on that note, I think we've kind of reached the end of this. It's 7:02. We started at 6:02. Thank you all so much for attending. This was absolutely invigorating for me, and I have a lot to think about now.
Thank you for coming. We really enjoyed this opportunity to share about our work. I am currently recording this, so as soon as it's done, I'm going to see if I can go ahead and crop it down and get that posted. But for whoever was unable to attend, that will be public and posted in the event page, so feel free to point people to it.
Yes, please check out the rest of the Art Week events, tip your Iowa artists, and abolish the police.
Yes. Come on, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.